A few fights before Leon Edwards defended his belt at UFC 296, MMA fans were treated with an anxiety-inducing fight that pinned a new rising star against an old guard that a lot of us fans really wanted to see win so he can finally retire. For those who don't know, this is Tony Ferguson. At the time of making this video, Tony holds the record for the longest win streak in UFC lightweight history, sitting at 12 fights. In his prime, Tony was a monster and had one of the most complete fighting styles in mixed martial arts. Not only did Tony have some pretty interesting striking, but he also had one of the slickest submission games in the UFC. But in the same way that Tony holds the record for the longest win streak in UFC lightweight history, since 2020 onwards, he now also carries the record for the longest lose streak in not just lightweight history, but now UFC history. And what makes this 7-fight losing streak even worse is that the last 3 people he faced were unranked. So, how did Tony Ferguson get in this position from being at the complete top of the pack at 155 pounds to now where he's on one of the biggest downfalls in the sport of mixed martial arts? In this video, we're going to break down the stats behind the career of Tony Ferguson, from his career highs and his career lows, and try to find out what led to his downfall. When we look at Tony Ferguson's career stats as a whole, you can find some interesting stuff. For example, you can see Tony has one of the longer reaches in the division, standing at around 76 inches. And when we look at some of Tony's previous opponents at lightweight, you can see that he's generally had the reach advantage by around 2 to 6 inches throughout. His strike accuracy sits at around 45%, which isn't the best, but his losing streak data is also compounded into the stat. Although his strike accuracy is lower than a lot of UFC fighters, his strike defense is actually pretty good and stands at around 55% even after adding all the losing streak data. But despite his strike defense being 10 percentage points higher than his accuracy, Tony still gets hit at a similar rate as he lands, showing that overall, Tony Ferguson isn't afraid to go toe-to-toe with his opponents. If we look at his overall significant strike distribution chart, you can see that Tony attempted almost 3,000 strikes in his 23-fight UFC career. Most of these strikes are to the head, although they're very inaccurate. But in a similar way that Tony Ferguson is very inaccurate with his overall significant strikes, his opponents weren't having that much success either, as he's received almost the same percentage of strikes to all the head, body, and leg targets as he's dealt. So in his overall career, Tony Ferguson isn't a statistically bad fighter. His strike accuracy and defense are actually very similar to other fighters that we've covered on this channel. However, there was once a time that Tony's stats looked even better than this. A time where he beat 12 increasingly skilled fighters and claimed UFC interim gold. Let's go over Tony's stats during his 12-fight win streak. During his 12-fight win streak in the UFC, Tony embraced all parts of the violence in the striking department. Since his reach was pretty large at 76 inches, Tony didn't really have an issue in connecting his jabs, crosses, or even his uppercuts on his opponents. And if we look at his significant strike distribution during his win streak, you can see his head strike accuracy was actually up almost 17% from his overall head strike accuracy. In a similar way that his head strike accuracy was up, his head strike defense was also up from his overall, and Tony only received 32% of the boxing combos coming his way. He usually avoided these strikes by fading and rolling away from shots. On the other side, if we look at Tony's significant strike accuracy during his losing streak, you can see that his significant strike distribution actually looks very similar to his overall significant strike distribution. His head strike accuracy is almost the same, and the main disparity is that Tony was attempting a lot more body strikes. His strike defense, however, was the thing that took the biggest toll during his losing streak, because if we look at that, you'll see that instead of him receiving 32% of his opponent's strikes, he now receives 52% of their strikes, putting his head strike defense from an amazing 68% to now at a not so amazing 48%. A 41% decrease. But can we chalk up Tony Ferguson's reason for his lose streak simply because his head strike defense is getting worse during his losses? Looking at Tony's significant strike defense throughout all of his fights in the UFC, you can actually see it's been trending downwards for a while now, even during his 12-fight win streak. It seems obvious to think that his strike defense catching up to him is leading to his losing streak, but it's not exactly the answer. Because during his win streak, Tony was getting hit with some very heavy shots. However, when he took some heavy blows in his win streak, he was quick to strike back with his own counters and barrages, which eventually overwhelmed his opponents, making it seem like his offense was acting as his main source of defense. And we can actually find a lot of truth in this if we look at Tony's significant strike output throughout each of his fights in the UFC. I removed the Kevin Lee fight from his win streak for better visualization. You can see right around here, which is about 3 fights into his win streak, Tony started to pick up his strike output by a considerable amount with each passing fight. What made it really impressive is that his strike output was trending higher even as his competition was overall better, almost in a similar way as Charles Oliveira trended during his win streak. What we can gather from this chart is that Tony Ferguson showed a lot of toughness on his come up to the UFC lightweight belt, relentlessly beating his foes using his unorthodox striking, countering his opponents after getting hit, and finishing them by knockout or submission. That is, until he met someone who was also on his come up and had a little more toughness to show. Enter Justin Gaethje, a fighter that Tony Ferguson didn't have to fight in order to get a crack at undisputed gold. But after his undisputed title shot was delayed due to the pandemic and a few other interruptions before that, Tony and the UFC decided that the show needed to go on, ultimately putting his title shot on the line as well. I mentioned earlier that during his win streak, Tony mostly utilized his offense as his main source of defense, and whenever he would take a hit, he would retaliate back on his opponent through counters. But against Justin Gaethje, he wasn't able to do any of that. Most of the time he got hit in that fight, he seemed alarmed. Like there was some big power differential between Justin Gaethje and Tony's previous opponents. And the few times that Tony was able to show that toughness that got him through his win streak, Justin Gaethje didn't give that same reaction as Tony's previous opponents. This, in turn, made his significant strike output go down as he couldn't really get started. Accumulate that over 4.5 rounds, and we can see an increasingly withered Tony that had to call it quits. It's been long speculated that the reason behind Tony Ferguson's decline was because of the amount of damage he took in his fight against Justin Gaethje. And given the stats behind all of Tony Ferguson's career, it's kind of hard to argue against that. Since that fight, he hasn't been landing significant strikes at the same rate as before. Tony's ground game isn't the same as before. And on top of all of that, he has to deal with a strike defense that's been trending downwards with every passing fight, despite his recent competition getting worse. By the time of Tony Ferguson's next fight, he'll be 40 years old, which is an age far from most fighters' peak. And although he's insistent on him continuing to fight, I think I speak for a lot of fans that I think he should retire. Looking back at Tony's career, there's a lot for him to be proud of. He had the longest and one of the most exciting win streaks in the UFC lightweight division. He was a person who really embraced the ugly parts of a mixed martial arts fight and always put on a show. He was a person who embodied the anytime, anywhere mentality by accepting risky fights that had no real benefit to him. And even during each hard fight he was in during his win streak, you can tell that he really enjoyed being in there. Here's to hoping Tony Ferguson can get that one last win before full retirement. Any additional charts that you see on screen right now will be available in the community post. If you like the content, consider subscribing, liking and sharing the video, and leaving a comment down below for discussion or video suggestions. And a quick reminder to be respectful in the comment section. Thanks everyone, and I'll see you in the next one.